Good afternoon and welcome to CCK Live. My name is Jenna Zelmer. I'm an attorney here at Chisholm, and Kilpatrick, and joining me today are Michelle DeTore and Lindy Nash, who both represent veterans before VA. And today we are going to be talking about cancer. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get into the topic. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to leave them in the comment box below, and we'll do our best to try to answer them or direct you in the right to the right place to answer those questions. We will also be linking more information on our blog, and let's get into it. So cancer, like any other disability, is treated by VA as a disability that could be service-connected if it's related to service. Now, there are a couple different ways that cancer can be shown to be service-connected. So obviously, if you are diagnosed with cancer while you are in service, that's probably the easiest way. But the problem is that a lot of veterans don't get diagnosed with cancer until many years after service. And why do we really see veterans develop cancer so far after their time in service? Well, a lot of times it depends on the things that they're exposed to in service. And VA has some policies in place to talk about, what chemicals they have conceded have been used in service and what chemicals they conceded may later develop into cancer. And like any other disability, VA has a bunch of different regulations regarding how they service connect them. So obviously, like I said before, if you have cancer in service, you can get direct service connection, but there are also different presumptions and different rules depending on what cancer you have and where you served that can come into play. So it's a really complicated area of law. Cancer isn't something that most people without medical training are competent or have the expertise to identify and diagnose. And so if you do have cancer and you are seeking to get it service connected, I would encourage you to reach out to your veterans representative, whether it's a veteran service organization, an attorney, anyone who has a little bit more familiarity with veterans law, because they can really guide you through that system. So I think mostly today we're going to be focused on exposure, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how VA rates cancer. So Lindy, the first most common exposure that we see a lot of veterans with cancer have is Agent Orange. Do you want to talk a little bit about Agent Orange?
Yeah, definitely. So as you said, one of the ways that we most often see cancer stemming from a veteran service is because they were exposed to Agent Orange or some other type of herbicide agent while in service. So typically we see this associated with Vietnam era class veterans. And so that can occur in numerous different places. So let me just hit on those really quick. The first one would obviously be time in Vietnam. So if you spent any part of your service in Vietnam, and if you were boots on the ground between 1962 and 1975, you are presumed to be exposed to Agent Orange. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But just to start off, that is if you've served in Vietnam and you actually step foot on the ground there. But additionally, in June 2019, President Trump signed into law the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act of 2019. And so that actually extended the presumption. So if you served aboard a ship in the open waters off the coast of Vietnam, but never went ashore, so you didn't have to step on land at all, you're offered the same presumption of herbicide agent exposure as those who stepped on foot on land. And then to be eligible for that, you have to serve offshore within 12 nautical miles of the demarcation line, again, between 1962 and 1975. And we'll touch on that again a bit later. Similarly, if you were in Thailand, VA has conceded use of herbicides there as well. And specifically, if you spent time on or near the perimeter of several different Royal Thai Air Force bases between January 1962 and May 1975, you may also have been exposed to herbicide agents. Another place would be the Korean DMZ. So Agent Orange was actually used in or near the Korean Demilitarized Zone, otherwise known as the DMZ. And VA will presume that you've been exposed if your unit was there. So the Department of Defense and VA have actually come up with a list of certain units who were exposed to Agent Orange or herbicide agents during the specific time, September 1967 to August 1971. So again, those are specific units. And then lastly, another type of exposure we see with herbicide agents is if you spent any time in Fort McClellan. So Fort McClellan was an Army base down in Alabama, and the Chemical Corps operated there. So a lot of hazardous chemicals kind of came and went through Fort McClellan. There was a lot of testing that was done there, and they actually closed in 1999. And while there's no presumption associated with Fort McClellan, there is evidence that PCBs and certain other chemicals leaked into the ground and the environment and contaminated the surrounding area. So those are kind of the most popular locations, and a lot of the arguments we make circulate around those areas.
Great. And I think that you did a great job of listing those kind of in order from most favorable or easiest maybe to establish a presumption to hardest. So
Yes.
What exactly is the VA's presumptive policy for Agent Orange? You know, of those locations, what do you think is the easiest, and which ones, you know, might a veteran need a little bit more help with?
Yeah, definitely. So under 38 CFR 3.309E, VA has conceded that if you were exposed to herbicide agents in service, several different conditions are presumptively service connected. And going along those lines, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, if you were in Vietnam, so if you were boots on the ground, meaning you walked on land in Vietnam between January 1962 and May 1975, you are presumed exposed to Agent Orange. So VA should not give you any trouble if you were to, say something like that, assuming that it's in your service records that you were there at that time. So that is, easier, if you will, to show that you were exposed to Agent Orange, and therefore, if you have a certain condition listed within 3.309E, you should be granted service connection relatively easily. Similarly, and it is kind of new law, so they're still working the kinks out, but with the Blue Water Navy veterans, it should be another similar situation along those lines. If you have proof that you were on a ship off the coast of Vietnam, 12 nautical miles from the demarcation line, again, you're presumed exposed to Agent Orange, and if you have one of those conditions, it should be, again, easy to prove that you were exposed, and therefore your condition should be granted service connection. Same with the DMZ, so the Korean DMZ, like I mentioned earlier, if you were in a specific unit, VA and DOD have recognized certain units. You can find that list online. They will concede that you were exposed to Agent Orange if you were there between September 1967 and August 1971. So those are kind of, I don't want to say best case scenarios, but those are some of the easier ways to show service connection for cancer is warranted.
And it's a double presumption, right? There are certain cancers that, so once you demonstrate that you're presumed exposed to Agent Orange, then there are certain cancers that are presumed to be due to exposure to Agent Orange, if that makes sense.
Yes, yep, exactly. And I will list all of those. And really quick, to go back to Fort McClellan for a second, that would be probably one of the harder cases to prove because there is no presumption associated with that. You definitely, most likely would need a medical opinion or someone who has the ability to link your condition to whatever exposure you're claiming due to your time at Fort McClellan. So those are the more challenging cases, and those definitely even give us a hard time here at CCK. So you need a lot of development and definitely a medical opinion. And then to go back to what Jenna was just saying, there are certain cancers that are listed in 3.309E. So if you were presumed exposed to Agent Orange, that's the first presumption. And then if you have a certain type of cancer, that's the second presumption. So those conditions or those cancers listed in that regulation would be chronic B-cell leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, different types of respiratory cancers, and also soft tissue sarcomas.
Great. And then obviously if a veteran has a different type of cancer, they can still qualify for VA benefits, right?
Yes, definitely. So just because you don't have one of those types of cancers that I just listed, that doesn't mean you're not deserving of service connection or VA benefits. It just means it might be a little bit more challenging of a road. But as long as you have a medical opinion, hopefully everything will be all set.
And, we have a lot of veterans who have been exposed to Agent Orange. New information is coming out every day about where Agent Orange was used. Just most recently, a study came out that suggests Agent Orange is used in Guam. So just because you might not be entitled to the presumption of exposure doesn't mean that you should give up on your claim. I would really recommend, checking out our website. We have a lot of information on Agent Orange. I believe that we even have a Facebook Live on Agent Orange. And like I said earlier, definitely talking to your representative about the best way to support your claim, because there's a lot of information out there and it can be a little bit overwhelming. So moving on from Agent Orange, the next big exposure type that we see is radiation. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about radiation?
Sure. So with radiation, VA has a presumptive policy for veterans who participated in radiation risk activity. So here you're going to be talking about on-site participation in testing involving atmospheric detonation of a nuclear device. But more specifically, you're going to be usually talking about your World War II veterans that were in Japan from 1945 to 1946. Any nuclear war testing, weapons testing, if they were assigned to any gaseous diffusion plants. There's actually 3 that VA notes in their regulations. You'll actually find that in 3.309. And those plants are located in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And the requirements are usually that you're there for at least 250 days, and it's prior to 1992. Prior to 1974, there was an area in Alaska where there was some underground nuclear testing. Some certain MOSs, which is a military occupational specialty, will have a veteran with exposure to radiation. So you're thinking kind of more like a X-ray technician, you maybe worked in a reactor plant, or you're working in nuclear medicine. There's also other various jobs in the military that could have exposed you. VA also has some certain operations that they believe would have probably put a veteran at risk for said exposure to radiation. You can also find that located in the regulations under 3.309, and it usually lists occupations and operations from 1945 to 1962, where you'll kind of see that exposure. So for radiation, VA pretty much concedes that almost all cancer could possibly be related to radiation. However, they do list out certain cancers that they believe are related to it, and I apologize, it's a lot. So it's bile duct cancer, bone cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, gallbladder cancer, liver cancer, lung, the pancreas, the pharynx, the ovaries, the salivary glands, the small intestine, the stomach, the thyroid, urinary tract cancers. You also have leukemias, lymphomas, and multiple myeloma. But like I said, VA has pretty much conceded that there is a possibility that most cancers are related to it. I think that just when you don't have it listed as VA conceding it already, there's that aspect of getting a medical opinion that you would need compared to these other ones. So when VA finds something to be presumptive, you usually don't need a medical opinion that finds that the said exposure, so here would be the radiation exposure, led to the cancer. But if VA hasn't already conceded that cancer is due to radiation exposure, then you're going to be needing not only, a current diagnosis of the cancer, you're going to need to show obviously the radiation exposure, but you're going to need that medical opinion from a doctor linking your cancer to that radiation exposure. Whereas if VA has already conceded it, you don't need that element for service connection.
Thanks, Michelle. That's a really good point, that when VA creates a presumption, they're essentially eliminating one of the elements that a veteran needs to show in order to demonstrate service connection. And so when Lindy and I were talking a little bit earlier about a double presumption, there are certain situations in which a veteran can get a presumption to have 2 of the 3 elements shown. So as long as you show that you have a disability, the in-service event and the nexus opinion are conceded. And so, that's probably the best outcome, the best possible situation for a veteran. But if you don't have that presumption, it doesn't mean, that you can't get service connected. It's just a little bit more development is necessary. And so I think that's a really good point, Michelle.
Yeah, it's an extra element that, you know, it makes your case just a little more difficult. It's not impossible to get one. You know, you can be talking with a lot of experts that work in the field or your actual doctors. It's just an additional hurdle to overcome compared to when something is already conceded as presumptive. And then with radiation exposure, I don't think a lot of people think about this as well. You have depleted uranium is also a way that you can be exposed to radiation. For this, you're really talking about your Gulf War veterans, more so your OIF, OEF, that's Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. So it's more of your current conflict that were likely exposed to this during their service. So that's another way which isn't as clear cut. That people think that you might have been exposed to radiation while in service.
Great. So we've talked about Agent Orange and radiation. I think those are probably the two most common types of exposures that we see, or at least that people, you know, think of when they think about what can cause cancer. You know, water isn't really something that you think would cause cancer, but Lindy, I think, is going to tell us otherwise.
Yes, so there is a base in North Carolina called Camp Lejeune. And if you were a veteran stationed there at Camp Lejeune between August 1953 and December 1987, you were exposed to toxins in the drinking water. The only restrictions are that you must have been there for 30 consecutive days and you need you cannot have a dishonorable discharge. But as long as you have those two things, VA will presume that certain cancers are caused by your exposure to the toxic water at Camp Lejeune. And those cancers would include adult leukemia, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, multiple myeloma, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So if you have one of those conditions and you can prove that you were at Camp Lejeune for 30 consecutive days during that specific period of time and you don't have a dishonorable discharge, you are entitled to service connection.
Great. And I think that we recently did a CCK Live all about Camp Lejeune.
Yes.
So you should definitely check it out. It has a lot of great information. If you served in Camp Lejeune, that'll probably get a little bit more into detail, but you should definitely know that if you have one of these cancers, you might be entitled to benefits. And lastly, in terms of kind of areas where veterans served that could have caused cancer is burn pits. So this is a little bit more recent than maybe some of the veterans who served, who were exposed to Agent Orange. More recently, veterans have been exposed to burn pit smoke. And Michelle, tell us a little bit about how veterans who served in burn pits can benefit from cancer disability ratings.
So with burn pits, just to provide a little background, you're talking about your current conflict veterans. So burn pits were basically used because people on base needed to find a way to get rid of everything on base. So they were burning anything from human waste, medical waste, plastic, tires. And as you can imagine, you're burning this in an open area and you're constantly burning this. So all the toxics, chemicals that were in, all the stuff is now in the air. Like I remember people telling you that if you leave a water bottle in the car for too long in the summer, like you should drink it. Can you imagine now you're breathing this in? So with burn pits, veterans were often on base, they were exposed to this stuff. And unfortunately with burn pits, currently there's no presumption. But there are some testing that's been done in the recent years where, you know, the Department of Defense went out, they tested the air sampling there to kind of see if there was chemicals or hazardous, you know, material in the air. And one of the things that they found and tested for was a chemical called TCDD, which is also a chemical found in Agent Orange. And as Lindy was discussing previously, there are several cancers that are linked to Agent Orange exposure. And, you know, our office, as well as other people, are of the belief that you should be able to argue that because you were exposed to burn pits, you were also, therefore, you should be presumptively given the right that this cancer that you obtained that is, you know, presumptive for Agent Orange, it should also be presumptive for burn pits because that chemical was also found in the air of burn pits. However, it's not just limited to that. You know, for burn pits, like we were talking about earlier, there's no presumption. So you are going to need a medical opinion. You can get medical opinions to link a lot of cancers. I know that we commonly, unfortunately, see a lot of brain cancers, and medical experts will usually link the brain cancer to the exposure to the in-service burn pits.
Great. Yeah, I think that the logic behind the tying the presumption that is currently in place for Agent Orange to burn pits makes a lot of sense. The presumption isn't based on the name Agent Orange, right? It's based on the underlying chemicals that VA has found to cause the cancer. And so if those same underlying chemicals are conceded to have been found in other places like burn pits, that's definitely something that we're trying to push VA in the right direction. But as I mentioned before, I think it's really important that if you have one of these cases where you think your cancer is due to your burn pit exposure, it's really important to make sure that you get the right representation, get a good doctor who kind of knows your situation and who knows both the law and the science behind it. So this will be interesting to see kind of where it goes in the future, and hopefully VA will kind of move in the right direction. And lastly, for exposures, we have occupational hazards. So this is a little bit less about where you served and what you were exposed to, where you served, but more about what you were doing in service. And Michelle mentioned earlier, an MOS is a military occupational specialty. So Lindy, how can an MOS result in cancer?
Yeah, so this is a little bit more unique, but we do see situations like this from time to time in our cases. So often if you are dealing with a certain type of cancer, it could be really helpful to look at your MOS and think back to what you were exposed to while you were doing those certain tasks in service that were associated with your occupational specialty. So a certain example could be, maybe you were around different industrial solvents, because these were often used in cleaning and degreasing, paint stripping, things along those lines. And within those industrial solvents are really dangerous chemicals, or can be dangerous, such as benzene or other hazardous chemicals, and that can cause cancer. So that's a certain example that we've seen before. If you used any of these dangerous chemicals during your daily routine, there's a chance that that exposure could have caused your cancer later on. And we've seen really, different types of examples. I have a client who was a military photographic specialist. And so he was exposed to all these different chemicals by processing photographs. And it hasn't been granted or anything, but that's a theory that we're looking into, because he said that he was around really serious chemicals while he was processing all of these photographs. So I just think it's important to, if you're dealing with a cancer like this, think back and try to remember if you were exposed to any sort of odd chemical or cleaning solvent, anything that you think could have potentially caused your cancer, because you never know. And there are certain experts who may be willing to opine that your regular exposure to those chemicals could have caused your cancer further on down the road.
Great. And in addition to some of those chemicals, I think a lot of veterans have asbestos exposure. And so, if you have certain lung disease or lung cancer or any sort of respiratory cancer, that's something to look into. Lead exposure. So yeah, I think that's a good point to if you don't have service in Vietnam during the correct time, or you weren't at Camp Lejeune, but you do have cancer, it's really important to think about any sort of potential theory or way that you might have been exposed to something. So good. So let's assume a veteran has overcome the first hurdle and obtained service connection. Michelle, how does VA rate service-connected cancers?
Cancers are pretty easy to understand how VA is going to rate them. If it's active, you're going to get 100%. And then if it's not active, VA usually waits 6 months, and then they will rate you based on the residuals of your cancer. However, I will say not always do they, check back to see if the cancer is going to remain active. Sometimes they understand that some cancers are terminal, some cancers are not going to get better. So you don't always get rescheduled for exams, but you oftentimes VA, when they do award 100% rating for a cancer, they'll let you know in 6 months or in a year, they're going to reschedule you for a new examination. So don't be surprised if you do get scheduled for one, and they're going to be basically assessing if it is still active, and if not, they're going to be assessing for the residuals of that condition. So that's kind of common what you'll see for VA handling cancers when they're active and not active.
Great. And yeah, for that time period in which a veteran is rated 100% for an active cancer, we call that a temporary total rating, because it's only 100% for the time that it is actually active. as opposed to permanent total. We have a lot of information about kind of the differences in temporary versus permanent and total, and how all the different ways that veterans can get a total rating. But like Michelle said, once your cancer is in remission, VA is going to rate you just based on the residuals of that cancer. So Lindy, what exactly are residuals?
Yeah, so rateable residuals can include anything that was either caused by the actual cancer itself or something that was maybe caused through the treatment of cancer. So maybe a certain residual developed after chemotherapy or something along those lines. So it really varies. We see all sorts of residuals from our clients. And one of the most frequent that I see is usually after prostate cancer. Some residuals follow, like urinary incontinence or avoiding dysfunction and things along those lines. So those two residuals can be service connected, and you can be compensated even though your cancer is no longer active. You're dealing with these residuals that are really severe and are causing a lot of trouble in your daily life. So when you do get scheduled for that exam, be as honest as possible. Let the examiners know what you're going through. It's not a time to hold back. Be honest with them about any kind of residual that you're experiencing, either exactly from your cancer or maybe from treatment, or anything along those lines. So just be as open as possible with your examiner. And if you aren't scheduled for an exam just yet, you can always submit a lay statement and explain to the VA what you're going through.
Great. We've hit a lot of information today, so I think we can wrap up. Do you guys have any advice or closing thoughts about, how veterans can navigate the system when trying to get service connected and rated for their cancer?
A lot of these are more straightforward than others. So we talked about, being in Vietnam, and if you were boots on the ground during a certain period of time, you are presumed to be exposed to herbicide agents, Agent Orange. And then if you have one of those cancers listed in the regulation, it should be pretty straightforward. So that should be again, easy case for VA to handle. However, if you have one of these more nuanced situations, it can be really difficult to navigate. And so, having representation or, reading blogs and doing your research can really benefit you. And then you may need a medical expert or opinion to substantiate your claim and get service connection. So don't be afraid to reach out to a medical professional and ask them if, your exposure to those cleaning solvents may have caused your current cancer.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Lindy was just saying about examinations. When you go and the cancer is no longer active, you really got to talk about what your residuals are, because that's what VA is going to be rating on. And they use mostly the VA examination to determine what those residuals are. So if for some reason they're not addressed or talked about during the examination, it is in your best interest to try to submit lay evidence and also know when it's time to, seek assistance from a representation, whether it's a veteran service organization, accredited practitioner, or attorney's office. It's always good to know what your options are, and they would be able to assist you usually.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today. I hope that this has been informational, and please visit our website at cck-law.com for more information about cancer and service connection and Agent Orange and all these really complicated situations that veterans face every day. We hope that we can do our best to, guide the process a little bit and make it a little bit easier. We will see you next week.